To discuss what's next for Afghanistan, we have on our panel Ambassador Omar Samad. He's a former Afghan ambassador to France and Canada. And joining us via Skype from Cambridge is Nafay Choudhury. He's a residence research fellow at the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies here in Washington, D.C. Michael Hanlon is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And here in our studio, Kamran Bokhari is a specialist in geopolitics of the Middle East and South Asia at the University of Ottawa. And I want to welcome all of you to the broadcast. Ambassador, why don't I start with you? And let's not particularly talk about voting. Let's talk about trepidation, because there's so much trepidation in this country. I mean, there's so much violence leading up to the elections. Talk to me about the psyche of the voters as they went to the polls.
Well, I think on one hand, obviously, after the Taliban made it quite clear that they were going to disrupt in any way possible these elections, and they took an anti-election posture, Afghans had a decision to make, I think. The electorate and the voter who was in a semi-safe environment had to decide whether they were going to go and vote or be safe and not take any risks. So it was a risk-taking decision. And it looks like at least 4 million or so Afghans decided that it was worth their while to go and vote and to send a message, both to the Afghan politicians as well as to the international community, and more importantly to those who wanted to disrupt the election process and take it to a different direction. I think that this trepidation seems to have created a sense of unity in the country. It has strengthened it to a large extent. Yes, there were a lot of issues that having to do with technicalities of the elections, how it was managed, even possibility of certain level of fraud from now on until we have results that may emerge. But overall, it was something that not many people expected, that so many Afghans would turn out and take the risk.
Nafay, I know that you did research before this election where you actually talked to a number of people in a number of different provinces, and there seemed to be this kind of, I guess, discouragement about the members of Parliament. What will they do when they're elected? Talk to us about what your studies showed leading up to the election, and then your thoughts on the election turnout and the election itself.
So, in my study that I did across Afghanistan, talking to 1,300 individuals across the country, just lay individuals, I wanted to get a nice sense of how they perceived elections. And by and large, one word that could describe it is disillusionment. And the real reason is that once they went to the polls, voted for their electoral candidate, the MP ended up disappearing and having very little accountability towards their constituents. And even in the voting that's going on right now, a lot of the reason that many people are not showing up, one, of course, is security, as Ambassador has just mentioned. However, a large reason is also disillusionment. And we can see from the 2005 to 2010 poll a steady decrease, and certainly a significant decrease this elections that's just been held, partly because of security, absolutely, but partly because of this large disillusionment. I'm afraid that despite all of the enthusiasm we have in this election, the issue of accountability won't really be addressed, and that's something that is going to haunt us for the coming electoral term.
It's interesting you talk about enthusiasm, because one of the most enthusiastic about this vote was the president himself, Ashraf Ghani. Let's listen to what he had to say about the vote.
Afghans did not only show to their enemies that they would not surrender to any threats or warning, but also they have the power and will to defeat the threats of enemies. Afghans showed to the world that they will only accept democracy in their country because democracy was not gifted to them by anyone.
Nafay says it's discouragement. He says it's determination. Michael, what's your take?
Well, I think that it's impressive that the Afghans went out and voted, but it's also in the context of an ongoing deterioration in the security environment and ongoing frustration, as your other guests have noted, with the state of Afghan politics. And I've been a supporter of the mission. I still am. The overall effort to help Afghans build a new country and defeat the Taliban. But it has to be acknowledged that every year it's a little harder to sustain that kind of confidence or hope, and I don't think the elections have really helped boost my spirits that much. I think one of the problems here is, in fact, the Afghan constitution that gives the president so much power and makes political parties so weak. And it's not just the constitution's literal stipulations, but also the way that's been interpreted. So when you have an election like this, there really are no big issues that are being debated for the most part in Afghanistan. I'd love to be corrected by your other guests who have been closer to this campaign than I have, but I still have the decided impression from my overall experiences in Afghanistan that these kinds of parliamentary election campaigns usually do not involve big debates on what to do about the future of the country, big ideas about new policies or programs, and therefore it becomes largely a referendum on personalities or on ethnic and other kinds of affiliations rather than on building a unified Afghanistan. So I guess I'm a little skeptical, except in one very simple sense, that this really helps pull the country together. I don't necessarily see that in my previous experiences with Afghan elections or what I know of this one so far. I'd like to be wrong, but I'm a little bit discouraged.
Let's get back to the security aspects in a minute, but I want to throw that to Kamran. Big issues debated. Did we hear that? Is he right on that score?
I agree with Michael. There are no issues being debated, and partly because of, as he mentioned, it's the constitutional and the structural problem with the state and how the political process is supposed to work. You've got a very strong president, although one can argue that after the last presidential election, 2014, the presidency is also shared. And now you have the entry of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hizb Islami that was looking forward to making some gains in the parliamentary elections. We'll see what happens to that. So what you are having is what I call the anti-Taliban camp, for a lack of a better term, is becoming more and more divided. And there are so many fissures within this camp, which is supposed to represent the mainstream. Why these elections are important is not because, we're going to have democracy tomorrow. That will take time. But because you need a mainstream if you are going to incorporate the Taliban as per a negotiated settlement. If you do not have a mainstream with which to absorb them in, then the risk of negotiating with them is that they may be able to dominate the political system and change it once they're in, or also through their military pressure. So it's absolutely critical that whether it's a weak political system, that the process continues, and we have to be patient.
Ambassador, you were on this broadcast after the presidential election. 7 million people went out and voted that time. And one of the complaints I remember hearing back then was that it was a strong president, a weak parliament. How much has changed since then?
Unfortunately, not much. We all expected more reforms. We all wanted the system to improve. We all wanted the leadership, as well as the political elites all together, to realize that we have lessons to be learned from the past and we need to correct them. I think now we have another opportunity to do so. Within 6 to 9 months, we will have presidential elections being held. Very important. I'm sure that a lot of big issues will come up during that particular contest. And as far as the mainstream is concerned, yes, there has to be mainstream. But I do believe that there is a strong mainstream in Afghanistan, despite all that looks divided and fragmented on the surface. I think that this election showed to a large extent that people, yes, do want security and do want peace, but they will not have peace at any cost and will not sell and lose and give away on what has been gained over the last 17 years. And the mainstream can be seen when General Razak was killed in Kandahar. The reaction was all-encompassing. The reaction came from all over Afghanistan, from all stratas of society. They all looked at him and said, well, he had his flaws, but he also was a bulwark. He stood against the enemy. He created some kind of stability in that region in the south. And so that is the mainstream in Afghanistan that I think exists. Some people do not want to acknowledge it, but it's up to the Afghan politicians to rally the people, to strengthen it, and to create that space that is needed for the Afghan Taliban, the armed opposition, if it wants to, because there's a big if, and when it wants to join the rest of Afghanistan. So I think that space needs to be created, and we need to work on it. It's not going to be very easy because, as they have demonstrated, they prescribe to a totally different system of governance.
Mm-hmm. Nafay, I wanted to just ask about some of the subjects that we've been talking about, which is, of course, this disillusionment that you addressed in your research. Given the fact that people went out and voted and yet are disillusioned that the members of parliament will go off and not really handle things, and Michael's saying that you know, there's really no debate of the big issues, what can be expected now that the elections come to a conclusion in a sense, although in 2 provinces the voting still hasn't taken place, and that's going to delay things even further?
Well, I think it's one thing that's very important is looking at it from 2 sides. One, we should be happy that the elections went underway, and this unity that it's drawn, well, it's showing that people are interested in still participating in the political process. And I found this across the board as well. If we can use the energy of bringing this country together, which was channeled quite well in this election, to actual reforms that create true forms of representative governance, then I think we'll be moving forward in a positive position. And there is leeway with a new term now, and with presidential elections coming up, and with the right momentum and the right targets in mind.
We need to take a quick break, and we will return to discuss the situation in Afghanistan, so stay with us.